of Peace show from the studio in WYOU in Madison, Wisconsin. And I am Luciano. And today we have two guests, Dr. Charlotte Streck from Focus on Climate and David Knuty from the Madison community.
I'll do a thorough introduction.
Yeah, please, David, take over the introduction of your group. And
Yes, I'm David Knuty from the Madison Committee on Foreign Relations. This is a volunteer community organization which presents speakers, a series of speakers throughout the year for our members and for the community. And we're very happy to have this opportunity, Luciano, to try a new medium to bring our speaker to a wider audience for a bigger impact than just our own members. Dr. Streck is a biologist, international lawyer, a scholar of issues on control of climate, measures to control climate, and a consultant to governments and private organizations around the world on the climate control process. We have been hosting her visit here in Madison. She's spoken to the climate research group at the university and a group of university experts on climate change, and last night to our meeting of the Madison Committee. So we are very pleased to be able to discuss the issues that she has been discussing with us for the past 2 days and share them. Charlotte, why don't you start out with a little bit about your organization, Climate Focus?
First of all, thank you, Luciano, for having me, and thank you, David, for inviting me. Climate Focus is a consultancy based in the Netherlands, initially headquartered in the Netherlands, with an office in Washington, D.C., where I live. We do provide advisory services to governments, to non-government organizations, and to the private sector on policies and measures that reduce the emissions of greenhouse gases, so in the climate change area.
Very good. Maybe you could go back a little bit about some of your various activities in this climate control process. They go back to the World Bank and to many experiences around the world.
Yeah, I'm trained as an environmental lawyer in Germany, where I initially worked, where I started my career. Then I came in end of '99. I came to Washington, D.C., worked at the World Bank in the legal department, but on international environmental law. Initially on more than climate, but very quickly it became clear that climate change was an emerging and increasingly important area, so that the last 4 years of my work with the World Bank, which I left in 2005, I focused exclusively on climate change. In this process and during the World Bank, my time at the World Bank, I also got sensitized to, in particular, to the to relevance of accommodating the need for developing countries in an area, in a time of climate change.
And you have been to many of the conferences. Perhaps, have you been to all of the UN conferences? Or
On the UN conferences on climate change, not to all of them. And by now, it's an increasing number. They started the sessions of the Conference of the Parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change started officially in '95, when the treaty had entered into force in '94, and ever since, annually there are big sessions of the meetings of the parties. By now, we also we don't have only the annual meetings. We have midterm meetings in June, and given the increasing complication as well as prominence of the climate change problem, we also have intersessional meetings. So today we have up to 4 or 5 sessions a year, and I couldn't do anything else if I were attending them all. But I have attended the most of the annual meetings, and also a fair number of the intersessional meetings.
Well, that makes you a real expert. Perhaps you could, many of us are unfamiliar with whole process of climate change control under the UN. And maybe you could give a brief overview of that framework, because I don't think any of us really understand it well enough.
Yeah, maybe those that are a bit older among you, you may remember in '92 there was a big Rio Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro. And back then, the world community adopted a number, or agreed to adopt a number of international conventions, among others the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was signed in '92 and entered into force after the majority of world countries had ratified it in '94, including the United States. The States is a party to the UN Framework Convention. It passed the Senate, and the US is an important member. Under the UN Framework Convention of Climate Change, protocols can be negotiated, and the first and only protocol that so far has been negotiated under the UN FCCC, so the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, is the Kyoto Protocol, which was negotiated and adopted in '97. And the US was part of the negotiation team, but it never passed the Senate, so the US is not a party to the Kyoto Protocol. Today, when we have the sessions of the UN meetings, we have at the same time the meeting of the parties of the UN Framework Convention, where the US is a full member, and the meetings of the parties to the Kyoto Protocol, where the US is a mere observer.
Mm-hmm. What exactly does the Kyoto Protocol require the participating governments to do? I understand there's two kinds of requirements.
Well, the Kyoto Protocol, and this is one of the problems certainly that see the industrialized countries, is that the Kyoto Protocol divides the world community in countries that are listed in Annex 1 of the protocol and those that are not listed in Annex 1 of the Kyoto Protocol. And in Annex 1, it's the industrialized countries and the economies in transition, so the countries of the former Soviet Union, to most notably Ukraine and Russia. And these countries that are listed in Annex 1, the industrialized countries, have committed to reduce, to adopt an economy-wide target to reduce greenhouse gases. And the US is listed in Annex 1, but again, it is not a party to the treaty, so it's not bound by this. The countries that are not listed, so in Annex 1, the developing countries, they are a party to the treaty, so other than often described in the press, they are part of the framework set by the treaty. They are also called upon to reduce emissions and to take measures to adapt to climate change, but they receive support from industrialized countries, in particular through carbon trading mechanisms like the Clean Development Mechanism.
Why is the U.S. not part of the treaty? Because the Congress didn't ratify the treaty, or there is another reason to that?
It is, of course, the formal reason is that it never passed Congress. And the U.S. is a country which has particularly strict requirements to become a party to an international treaty. In most countries, a normal majority in parliament is sufficient, so the ruling party normally, if the head of state agrees to a treaty, has little problems to pass it through parliament. The US, for historical reasons, is much more reluctant, from the way how the system has been set up, more reluctant to become a party to international agreement. It requires a much larger majority, in particular in the Senate, where 2/3 of the senators need to agree to ratify a treaty. And that majority was and is not possible to get for a climate change treaty. The underlying reason why the Senate is reluctant and has been reluctant is that there's mostly the feeling that an economy-wide cap on greenhouse emissions would compromise the US economy, the standard of living of the country. So it would be economically not acceptable.
The last Copenhagen conference was covered very extensively and with a great sense of disappointment, I think, in balance. there was a hope, I understood, that there would be a new Kyoto Treaty. What exactly were the objectives of the conference?
The objective of the conference, and there was a process that led to the conference, there was a roadmap, so there was more than 2 years of negotiation leading to the Copenhagen 15th session of the parties to the UN Framework Convention. The objective was to come to an agreement on a global deal on climate. Very ambitious, probably too ambitious. The reason why there is a certain urgency to come to that treaty is that the Kyoto Protocol commitment period, which defines in which period the countries that have assumed targets, that this commitment period expires in 2012. And in the absence of any other agreement, there is no ambitious way or measure to or agreement among the international community to reduce emissions. So it was always the intent that whether the Kyoto Protocol will ever see a second commitment period or not, or whether it will be replaced by another treaty, but something should be in place by the end of 2012 and also enforced by 2012. I think by now we know that this will not happen, but the ambitions for Copenhagen was to agree on a treaty which was acceptable to the US, which would increase commitments, have a stronger way of including developing countries, in particular emerging economies, in particular countries like China and India, which do not have mandatory obligations to reduce emissions under the Kyoto Protocol. And it is very clear that somehow these developing economies, the emerging economies, need to be brought into the system in a more ambitious way. Mm-hmm. And that has failed. It has failed in a painful way. It is fair to say that these 2 weeks in Copenhagen were the most painful in my career. You sit there and you see with these thousands of people, and you still have a hope, even if you are not, that there will be an agreement, but you see, the train racing against this wall, and it will happen, and still it's painful. The moment it hits, and you see, okay, we will not have anything coming out of here which is legally binding or ambitious or anything, it's still
What were some of the underlying dynamics at work that caused the failure? Or I admit the governments were reluctant, but there was also certain other issues or process issues?
It was a bit everything, and so I'm a bit cautious. After Copenhagen, in the newspapers you would read different explanations. It's the fault of the US, it's the fault of the Chinese, it's the fault of the Danish, it's the fault of the bad organization of the conference, and I think it's a bit all of the above. It is certainly that the US and China as key protagonists in the process didn't agree and didn't have anything really to bring to the table. There were not enough room for compromise. But it was also a process and a conference that was not handled with skill, diplomatic or organizational, by the host, by the Danish presidency. The European Union too long believed that a legally binding agreement was a possible option, so there was not enough flexibility. And most importantly, there was no plan B. At the moment when it was clear that there was no global deal coming out of Copenhagen, nobody had a real plan B or plan C or plan D and saying what to do now, which led us with a situation that when President Obama landed in Copenhagen, and with him 120 other heads of state, there was no agreed text. So normally you would think when a head of state arrives somewhere, they read a bit, they discuss here and there a sentence, but then they sign, and then they give a press conference. Nothing of this was prepared in Copenhagen, and we had the interesting situation that head of state actually need to show leadership and needed to negotiate. And if it wasn't for President Obama, who in the last minute at least pulled the key nations together to negotiate a document, the so-called Copenhagen Accord, we wouldn't have anything coming out of this conference. Not everybody agreed to the process and to the document or the level of ambition in the Copenhagen Accord, so it was never adopted formally, but it is still a document which has the advantage that is guiding the international negotiations today.
That's a very interesting summary. Luciano, excuse me?
Well, I was wondering, how does the conference work practically? I mean, they make small group, or they are like 125 head of state around the big table talking all at once. How does do they get in secret meeting?
Yeah, well, it's a chaos, and it is for somebody who is not used to it. It's very hard to understand, and even for somebody like me who has been to many of these conferences, I only follow a limited number of tracks in the negotiations. I can well sit in a meeting and after 20 minutes reading something, listening to something, not have a single understanding or a clue what they're talking about. So it is, you need to, what is it? What is the most, it's a chaotic system with limited organization in the sense that there are tracks of negotiations. So there are people that look particularly at the mitigation of greenhouse gases or adaptation to the adverse effects of greenhouse gases, or aviation and bunker fuels, or forest-related issues. And in some of these groups, are open to observers, other groups are not open to observers. It's not always easy to find out where something happens and who is allowed in and who is not, and which are the documents. So this one has to be a conference professional a bit to do this. So, which is then interesting. There is an increasing number of private sector participants attending these conferences as observers, and I think they definitely lose faith in anything which has to do with bureaucracy and UN after coming out of it, because it's so obscure to a certain way. On the other hand, some of these, the NGOs, the environmental groups, but also other lobbyists, they are highly skilled professionals in understanding this process. So it's government and non-governmental organizations that understand it, but it is difficult for those that are just conference tourists in a way to come there and understand it.
Perhaps you could talk a bit about this Copenhagen Accord. What is actually the substance of what was agreed to, and how is it, well, what's the requirements going forward?
The Copenhagen Accord, first of all, sets a level of ambition. It says that the world community agrees that the global warming, so the average temperature, should not rise above 2% centigrade above pre-industrial levels. And that's important because it essentially sets, the vision, or it establishes the vision on where we want to go. Other than the Kyoto Protocol, it doesn't follow then the logic to say this accord establishes particular targets that would apply to countries. It is, and it marks a complete change, a change in paradigm, I would say, in the way how to approach climate change commitments, in the sense it is establishing a pledge and review process. It says that countries should contribute, that industrialized countries should contribute by adopting economy-wide targets, and that developing countries should adopt what they call nationally appropriate mitigation actions. It can be any kind of policies or sectoral targets, anything. But it doesn't say how much, and it doesn't say which level of ambition. It leaves it up to the countries, to the governments, to the national processes to decide on this. And it then opened, under the Copenhagen Accord, it opened the room and the space for countries to communicate their commitments to the UNFC Secretariat. And this is the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change Secretariat. And if you go to the website of the UNFC today and you click on Copenhagen Accord, you see what the different countries have communicated, what the target, the actions that they want to take. And this can be the European Union saying we want by 2020 to reduce greenhouse gas emissions 20%. It can be Ethiopia, which says we want to contribute by reducing emissions through activities in agriculture, or by expanding hydroelectric power and exporting hydroelectric power to neighboring countries. So it can be can be a wide range of different issues. But the understanding is that there is at least a review process, that if one communicates this to the UNFCCC, there is a certain measure of accountability in this process.
And you're saying there is a web page where people can have
Yes.
access to, do you know the web page?
Yes, and it is an interesting, it has a wealth of information on the whole, on climate change. It has something for journalists, for laymen, laypersons that are not expert, up to the very technical documents. It's www.unfccc.org. So it's, it can keep you busy for months reading it.
Are there some examples of good things that have transpired from the Copenhagen commitments?
I think many countries actually have taken action, and there's an amazing level also of activity, but also of cooperation in particular areas. So we have developing countries taken ambitious targets, most notably in the area of reducing emissions from deforestation, which is a significant source of emissions. Just to keep a bit the perspective, the US and China are the largest emitters, mostly through industrial emissions, followed by Indonesia and Brazil. And these countries have very little industrial emissions, so it's purely land use emissions. But these countries, in particular Brazil, have agreed to take very ambitious targets, 80% reduced emissions from deforestation, which is an enormous amount. They work in close partnership with industrialized country governments that contribute to financing this, so there's a lot happening. China has relatively ambitious goals with reducing the energy intensity of its growth. It also has put a lot of money into renewable energy and in various policy and programs related to energy efficiency. So China may not be willing to agree on a target internationally, but it has an ambitious national program on climate change and national targets on climate change.
Mm-hmm. So we have another meeting coming up in Cancun. And what can the world expect from this meeting, or what should the world expect from this meeting?
First of all, the good thing is that the expectations are low, so there's room for positive surprise.
Copenhagen put the bar very, very low.
So since by now the belief in a UN-facilitated climate change process is close to zero, so there is at least when you read the newspapers,
room for improvement.
There's definitely room
Lots
for
of room
improvement.
for improvement.
Exactly, and so it may actually be that following this new paradigm of bottom-up and smaller groups and a bit less global, less fixation on this one deal. We may see good things coming out of Cancun. We may see an agreement on a decision on creating these incentives to reduce deforestation. We may see something on technology transfer. We may see something on adaptation. We may see something on the establishing on a global fund for climate change. All this is important because it will bring together countries that work on implementing these commitments, and it will build trust. The big problem that is not solved is the overall lack of ambition, in particular by the industrialized world. There is this game that nobody really comes forward with sufficiently ambitious targets. The big problem is that the US, through the failure of getting climate change legislation adopted, doesn't bring anything to the table. Mm-hmm. So when it comes to the point to say, what have you done since Copenhagen? The US has not so much, at least on the federal level. I acknowledge there's a lot of municipal action and state action, but it has not passed climate legislation, mm-hmm. which we always still hopeful when we met in Copenhagen it would happen. But again, I'm an optimist. I couldn't do my job without being an optimist. So I think at least in some areas we will see progress.
Great. You've pointed out that the host government has a lot of influence on how the conference works out. And I know you have talked a bit to the Mexican government about how they should organize and fulfill these responsibilities. Maybe you could talk a bit about their approach.
I've worked with the Mexican government on particular, not on the organization of the conference. I wouldn't be the person to do this, but more on some of the content issues. But the Mexican government was certainly aware and is aware of well, they have inherited the problems that they have inherited. So the first half of the year, they engaged in an enormous trust-building process. They traveled to all the countries and the regional groups. They met with everybody. They took the pulse. They built confidence and trust, seeing, giving the individual governments and people time to air their discontent about Copenhagen and what happened. And then slowly they moved towards looking where to take this from there and where progress was possible. And I think they did a very good job, and they do a good job, and they certainly, are facing a very difficult situation. They will, in terms of logistics, they have moved the meeting to Cancun to make sure that people are not stuck for hours in traffic in Mexico, in the capital of Mexico City. Cancun has sufficient hotel capacity, so many things that we had in Copenhagen a problem, and the logistics will not be relevant. That said, I think the Mexicans have done what they can. At the end, it will depend on the last-minute surprises and the willingness of the negotiators on whether that is sufficient.
Who decide where this conference happen?
It goes rotating among continents. Mm-hmm. So it is. Last year it was in Europe, okay. And then it goes to Latin America. Then it goes to Asia. And then within the idea is that different regions should have the opportunity to offer to hold a COP. If nobody steps forward, because it's an expense, right, and it's very difficult and an expense to organize such a conference. So even in case nobody volunteers, then always per default the meetings happen in Bonn, where the headquarter of the UN Convention is situated, and so Bonn in Germany is a default place if nobody volunteers.
If nobody volunteers.
Yeah.
And is any funding from the country who hosts is funding the project, or does it get? Because it seems like it will cost a lot of money in security. I mean, already we see how much it costs to have Obama coming to Madison. When you have 100-something head of state who are coming, you must.
It's a lot more expensive when the head of state's actually coming. Now to Cancun, they won't come. It was on the ministerial level, so they only come on in very important occasions and when there is a lot of expectation. So Copenhagen was an exemption in that sense, but it's still very expensive, and so to a large degree it is shouldered by the hosting country. There is support from the UN Secretariat for some of the delegates traveling. There's support for developing countries to participate, but it's limited, and it's understood that, of course, the biggest expense comes to the hosting country. But there is, of course, countries appreciate the reputation that come with this, the visibility that come with this. So it was in Copenhagen, it goes now to Mexico, then it is in South Africa, and then it is probably in Korea. So it is, you see it is traveling around.
Could we change the subject a bit? You have been, I think, exposed to a lot of the controversy around the scientific process underlying the negotiations, and of course these were the subject of a lot of hot debate and newspaper coverage over the so-called ClimateGate revelations of internal communications among scientists and so forth, and some glitches in the reports, the official reports. Perhaps you could talk about what exactly was the ground of this controversy, and how do you see it, the meaning of it?
Well, first of all, there was a lot of press coverage. So I think the most interesting thing about it is what the press made out of it. And in particular, in this country, there was comparatively more press coverage on the alleged problems in the scientific peer review process than in most other countries. And the other important thing is that there were problems, and I don't try to justify anything, but they were comparatively minor, but they have done great harm to the perception, in particular in the US, of where climate science stands, and that is puzzling for scientists, because it is important to keep in mind that 98% of the scientific community and almost all those participating or contributing to the peer-reviewed, so high-level scientific debate, are convinced that anthropogenic climate change is happening. There is discussions on this is part of the scientific process. There are insecurities in elements to this, but the general trend is uncontested. So what happened in the Climate Gate? There are two different things. There's the Climate Gate scandal. It refers to a criminal act, and it refers to hackers going into the system of UK universities, the University of East Anglia, and retrieving large amounts of emails of the last 10 years, going through these emails of very reputable climate scientists, and finding or claiming to find in these emails indication that these scientists had manipulated the peer-reviewed process, that they didn't give a voice to climate skeptics, and that they had hidden some of their assumptions. I don't know the details, because it's an enormous amount of emails and information. But what is certain is that a number of committees and investigations have launched based on this act, on the release of these emails, and all of them, and including the UK House of Commons and various universities in the US, have looked at this, and all of them have come to the conclusion that there was no serious wrongdoing of any of the scientists. And these rebuttals have received much less public attention than the actual allegation, and that's important. Another problem was with the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It brings together thousands of scientists, and there was a wrong quote, or a quote to a non-peer-reviewed paper in a section that referred to the retreat of glaciers in the Himalaya, which was wrong. But it's important that the actual section and chapter on glaciers was without mistakes. It was a reference in an unrelated chapter, which was not focusing on glaciers, where it was a wrong or non-peer-reviewed quote, which was wrong. But I must say, and this is my personal opinion, if climate skeptics have launched such an enormous amount or have dedicated time and resources to discredit science, and the only thing that they found is a wrong quote in a report that has thousands of pages, and problems in emails which turned out not to be any of them. I must say we have a hell of a good scientific process, and I can congratulate the scientists in medicine and everywhere. It's a very, very robust process.
And you say in a 10-year period.
Yes, and essentially there was one wrong quote in the IPCC, and there were a number of smaller, minor other issues. But given that somebody has really combed through all this and looked at all this, there's room for improvement, and there's always room for improvement. But we have a very robust scientific peer review process.
Now, we've seen the polls in the United States that the faith in the findings of the climate control or the climate science process has dropped from 70 to 58%, something like that. What's happened in the rest of the world? Is there any kind of will the delegates be having any kind of second thoughts as they come to Cancun based upon local reactions?
No, the doubt in the climate science is a U.S. problem to the large extent. With all my traveling and working internationally, and there is no country where so systematically climate science has been discredited in a way, and generally public opinion supports the opinion and the fact that climate change is real and happening. I'm not saying that public opinion in all countries supports action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and there are the concerns about the economic impact of these measures are shared beyond the US borders. But the doubts with respect to the climate science are largely, again with some exception, but largely confined to the US.
And why is that? I mean, this is a country who believe in science. I mean, I don't know.
I don't know, and I'm puzzled by this myself, because it is this country, it's a wonderful country which brings about the best climatic scientists, which has more peer-reviewed journals than any other country, which has among the best universities on the world, and still there is a disconnect between that community and what it produces, and wide, broad layers of the society, which I do not completely understand. I have a vague idea that the media have a role in this, of distorting maybe some of the facts, or not giving the same airtime to those that want to communicate the scientific findings than to those that want to discredit them.
Yeah. Perhaps we could close with some thoughts, some positive thoughts. You spent quite a bit of time on the ground working with people who are actually implementing climate mitigation projects. And I know you have some heartwarming stories about some of the good things happening. Maybe you could conclude with a few things that are happening on the ground in other places because of the efforts and the funds provided for this purpose.
Yeah, certainly what keeps me going in my profession, in my professional life, is not going through UN climate change negotiations. That are not very inspiring moments, and not moments that would give me the energy to keep going. Now, what it is certainly is work on the ground, in particular in developing countries, with people, and that can be government, it can be non-government, it can be private sector, that use new sources of climate finance to implement projects, whether it is solar home cookers or biodigesters, helping to bring development and electricity to rural poor in electrification initiatives. But it is also, I spend a lot of time in the area of forest and land use, so working with countries on moving to a climate resilient agriculture, meaning agriculture that can better react or absorb or the adverse effect of climate change, so it's more resilient on one hand, on the other hand more carbon rich and sequesters more carbon, and increases at the same the productivity and thereby the income for the farmers. I'm working at the moment in a project in Ethiopia with a coffee sector, just returning from Ethiopia, where hopefully, if it works, and if we can forge a partnership between the countries that contribute to climate finance and the coffee cooperative on the ground, we can do a lot of good, and that keeps me going.
Very good. Well, this has been a wonderful experience to have you here and hear about some of these world dynamics that are just impossible to understand, I think, on the ground here.
Yeah, it's very complex. In fact, a lot of time we ask, what can we do? It seems like certainly we are so removed from an abstraction. I mean,
but everybody can do everything.
Yeah,
yes,
right.
first of all, certainly everybody can do something, whether it is in the small area of your influence. It is. It's energy efficiency, reducing the use of energy, or moving to public transport. using trains instead of cars. But I think the most important thing, and that's also close to my heart, is I think that we need to talk. We need to talk to our children, and we need to talk to young people, and we need to put climate change into the curriculums of our schools and our kindergartens, so that the children know about this and can adapt and don't fear the consequences, and that's important because that's the hope that we have.
I mean, is there a possibility that this conference become irrelevant if countries and people are doing their own thing, like you mentioned? What become the relevance of this conference?
I think at the moment the conference helped to keep countries accountable. Respect to, other than the ambitious is still that they should set an international framework, but in the absence, certainly they hold countries accountable for their action. But the more countries are doing and the more success we have, the less controversial or the less important the actual event will be. And some examples from successful international cooperation and conventions show that the more along one goes in implementation, the less important this individual conference will be.
I like the Swiss motto, jeder gibt, was kann, each what each can. So.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Well, thanks a lot, Charlotte, for coming over here and for the work you're doing, and you too, David.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, I wish you a good
Luciano.
trip. And thank you for watching. This is WYOU, Community Access Television in Madison, Wisconsin, that you can watch on channel 991, channel 95, wyou.org, and you can also see this video on vimeo.com/BrazonVideo. Thank you for watching, and please support Community Access TV.
A new medium to bring our speaker to a wider audience for a bigger impact than just our own members. Dr. Streck is a biologist, international lawyer, a scholar of issues on control of climate, measures to control climate, and a consultant to governments and private organizations around the world on the climate control process. We have been hosting her visit here in Madison. She's spoken to the climate research group at the university and a group of university experts on climate change, and last night to our meeting of the Madison Committee. So we're very pleased to be able to discuss the issues that she has been discussing with us for the past 2 days and share them. Charlotte, why don't you start out with a little bit about your organization, Climate Focus?
First of all, thank you, Luciano, for having me, and thank you, David, for inviting me. Climate Focus is a consultancy based in the Netherlands, initially headquartered in the Netherlands, with an office in Washington, D.C., where I live. We do provide advisory services to governments, to non-government organizations, and to the private sector on policies and measures that reduce the emissions of greenhouse gases, so in the climate change area.
Very good. Maybe you could go back a little bit about some of your various activities in this climate control process. They go back to the World Bank and to many.
Peace show from the studio in WYOU in Madison, Wisconsin, and I am Luciano, and today we have 2 guests, Dr. Charlotte Streck from Focus on Climate, and David Knuty from the Madison Community.
I'll do a thorough introduction.
Yeah, please, David, take over the introduction of your group. And
yes. I'm David Canuti from the Madison Committee on Foreign Relations. This is a volunteer community organization which presents speakers, a series of speakers throughout the year for our members and for the community. And we're very happy to have this opportunity, Luciano, to try experiences around the world.
Yeah, I'm trained as an environmental lawyer in Germany, where I initially worked, where I started my career. Then I came in end of '99. I came to Washington, D.C., worked at the World Bank in the legal department, but on international environmental law. Initially on more than climate, but very quickly it became clear that climate change was an emerging and increasingly important area, so that the last 4 years of my work with the World Bank, which I left in 2005, I focused exclusively on climate change. In this process and during the World Bank, my time at the World Bank, I also got sensitized to, in particular, to the to relevance of accommodating the need for developing countries in an area, in a time of climate change.
And you have been to many of the conferences. Perhaps, have you been to all of the UN conferences? Or
On the UN conferences on climate change, not to all of them. And by now, it's an increasing number. They started the sessions of the Conference of the Parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change started officially in '95, when the treaty had entered into force in '94, and ever since, annually there are big sessions of the meetings of the parties. By now, we don't have only the annual meetings. We have midterm meetings in June, and given the increasing complication as well as prominence of the climate change problem, we also have intersessional meetings. So